I was 28 years old when the order came down from headquarters. A crisp sheet stamped with an eagle that told me, in the neat grammar of authority, to comb the villages east of Krakow and move anyone deemed suspect to the transit depot by the river. Obedience had been the grammar of my life for so long that I hardly registered the words as anything but schedule. But that morning a fog sat low over the fields, and the horse's breath made ghosts in the air, and I kept hearing my mother's piano inside my skull, a melody that did not belong in the mud of Poland. And it was this dissonance, more than any moral schooling, that set the day on the crooked track from which I never returned. I had started as a cadet with tidy ambitions and boots that squeaked. I wanted rank, clean rooms, and the certainty that uniforms promised to boys who fear their own shadows. By 1943, I had learned the sound a locked door makes when the person behind it stops pleading. I wore an officer's coat that hung too heavy on the shoulders in spring, and kept my hair shorn and my voice clipped. Because a clipped voice could carry across a yard, because if you spoke like a metronome, other men fell into time with you, and because rhythm, I had discovered, was a kind of armor against chaos. The village was small, a ring of houses with flaking blue trim, a broken church bell, a bench whose planks were polished by generations of worry, and a dirt road that gave up to mud at the slightest suggestion of weather. My men fanned out, two to a door, and I stayed by the truck with the ledger, practicing, as I often did, the ritual of pretending not to see who was pushed through the gates. The first family came quietly, the second cried, the third spat and then cried, and by the time the fourth stumbled toward the truck, an old man in a threadbare coat, a woman whose shawl smelled like damp hay, and a boy with black curls half hiding his eyes, I had put on the officer's look, the one I had learned from my superior, flat and unreflective as a lake in winter. I wrote down their names and waved them toward the truck, and thought that would be the measure of my cruelty for the day. But the fog did something to sound. It folded the world closer, made every step seem inside my ear, and when a gunshot cracked from the far house, my pen jumped, my ledger tilted, and from the alley by the bakery a small shape broke into a sprint. A child with a too-big coat flapping like a torn flag, and the child slammed into my legs, bounced, went to the ground, and covered his head with both arms like someone used to falling. He was perhaps 8 years old, maybe 9, with a bruise along the cheekbone and a mouth too brave for the rest of his face. He smelled of ashes and wet wool. A woman's voice rose from the alley, not language, just sound. Then another shot. The child did not cry. He looked at me. No, he looked past me, through me, as if searching a map invisible to everyone else. And then he grabbed at the hem of my coat and whispered in German, "Badly, don't let them see me." I could have tossed him to a corporal. I could have shouted the word that turned boys into inventory. Instead, I took one step sideways so that my body cut the line of sight from the alley to the road, and I barked to no one in particular. Perimeter left. Men ran where my finger pointed. The child slid behind the truck's tire, as if he had invented the act of hiding. My brain did its arithmetic. He was Jewish, they were hunting, and if I lifted my hand he would vanish into the machinery that I, a small cog, had helped to oil. There are moments when biography and doctrine tear apart, like two boards pried loose by a crowbar, and something raw and splintered is exposed. I bent down as if to tie my boot, which was already tied, and whispered, "Stay. Do not move until I say." He nodded with the ferocity of a soldier receiving instructions. I ordered my sergeant to check the bakery. He vanished into the fog with 2 men, and came back with flour on his sleeves and no woman. "Ghosts," he said. "Or rats." I grunted a performance and slammed the ledger shut. "Load them," I told the driver, meaning the families who had arrived before the shots. The child's eyes tracked the movement like a trapped animal's. I could feel my heart beating in my hands. By noon, the fog burned off and the road turned to glue. I sent the truck ahead with the first group and kept 4 men with me to sweep the eastern lane. I told them to break, light cigarettes, piss, complain. They did. Officers are expected to simulate both control and indifference, a difficult alloy that I had learned to pour without thought. While they smoked, I walked to the back of the truck, leaned on the bumper, and tapped the tire with my baton like a man inspecting rubber. "Out," I said softly. He emerged, blinking. Name? I asked. He licked his lips. Luka, he said in Polish accented German, then corrected himself. Lukasz, and then, as if that were wrong too, tried again. I am Eli. I did not ask which name was true. Truth was a luxury that had been confiscated from this land. Where is your family? I said instead. He swallowed. They went to the school, he said. The soldiers said there would be soup. Behind us, one of my men laughed at a joke about boots. I crouched, which made my coat pull tight under the arms, and put my hand flat on the dirt. Listen, I said. If you run now, they will see you. If you stay with me, I can delay their seeing. The grammar failed me. I had commanded men to their deaths with cleaner sentences. You will be quiet, I said finally. He nodded with a seriousness that shamed me. I told him to walk 3 paces behind me and to look at the ground when anyone spoke. When my sergeant asked, "What's that?" I had already arranged my face. Interpreter, I lied. Because lies are easier when they have the cadence of authority. The last unit left him here. They were trying to ask about roads. The sergeant shrugged. Rats and children, he said philosophically. At least children don't steal your bread. He gave the boy a look that was not unkind. We set off toward the school. The schoolhouse was brick with a roof that had surrendered 1/3 of its tiles to wind and age. A line of people stood in the yard, pale as if the fog had moved inside their skin. A corporal checked papers. Another marked wrists. A third wrote numbers and looked bored while doing it. It was the boredom, more than the numbers, that twisted my stomach. I did not need to step inside to know the layout, where the classroom would be turned into a holding room, where the teacher's desk would become an altar for the ledger, where the chalkboard would list by dusk a set of names that did not know they were being arranged for transport. I put my hand on Eli's head for a fraction of a second, the way you would steady a stack of plates that might topple, and then I took it away, because I remembered abruptly that if anyone noticed, I could end both our stories with a gesture. Stay behind me, I said again. His breath came fast. The queue shuffled. The corporal raised his eyebrows at the boy. What's this, sir? He said. Interpreter, I repeated. The corporal squinted as if reading a page in poor light. He looks hardly 10. Children hear everything, I said. The corporal smirked. True, he waved us through. Inside, the air smelled like chalk and wool and fear. On the wall hung drawings, blue suns, red houses, a cat drawn by a child who had never seen a cat hold still. I have carried those drawings longer than I have carried my name. It would be a simpler, perhaps nobler story if I told you. I decided then and there to save him, because a dam inside me broke and the flood of conscience washed the filth of my uniform away. Truth is smaller than that. I decided to save him because I realized in a moment so sharp, it felt like the skin of the world had been peeled back. That I had the specific leverage, the petty authority, and the practiced voice to move exactly one person out of the machine at exactly this hour, and that no one would notice if I did it carefully. The scope of your power does not excuse its use. It simply makes it undeniable. I called my sergeant. We need a runner to take a note to Captain Weiss at the depot, I said. The boy can go. The sergeant looked skeptical. He is small, he said. He can move fast, I replied. And if partisans are watching, they will not waste a bullet on a child. A moral lie. He shrugged and spat. I took the boy into the cloakroom, a narrow space with a row of hooks and a broken window big enough for the memory of wind. You will go out the back, I whispered. Take the ravine. 2 kilometers north, there is an old mill with 3 stones stacked like steps. Wait under the steps. Do not come out until you hear 3 knocks. If it is not me, do not come out. His eyes were enormous. Will you come, he said. I will come, I said. And it was only when I heard the words formed in my mouth that I realized I had decided to carry them out. I pressed the slip of paper into his hand. The slip was real, addressed to a captain who existed, stamped with a mark I had the right to use, and it told him to present himself for temporary reassignment, a phrase so bureaucratic that it nearly disguised mercy. He ran then, as he had run in the alley, but now his running had a direction I had drawn for him, and I discovered that drawing a direction is the closest thing to prayer I have ever done. Gestapo men arrived before dusk. Trench coats with hard eyes who pretended to be bored and were not. Boredom was a luxury of mid-level killers, not of the ones who mapped terror like surveyors. They asked for my ledger. I gave it. They asked if anyone had tried to bribe me. I said no, though a woman had pressed a ring into my hand and I had returned it because I did not know how to weigh grief in grams. They asked why my unit had held back 2 of the eastern streets until after lunch. Terrain, I said. We had to clear a ditch. The shorter one nodded, undecided about whether to make trouble. They sniffed the air like mechanics sniff gasoline, deciding if the engine would catch. At length they moved on, taking 3 men in the line because 3 made a pattern that comforted them. I released the breath I did not remember holding and set the schoolroom in order for night, because order is a drug and I was not yet clean. Then I went to the ravine. The moon had not yet risen. The mill crouched like a giant who had forgotten what he was meant to do with his hands. I knocked 3 times on the stones. No answer. I waited. The cold crept under the coat and down the spine in slow teeth. I knocked again. "It is me," I said in a voice too soft for even foxes to hear. A shape detached itself from the dark, a trembling shape, a child's breath made visible. He had hidden so well that I felt a stab of unnatural pride. "Come," I said. "We will go to a farm." He shook his head. "They will catch us." "Yes," I said, and the truth calmed him more than lies would have. "They will try. We will make it harder." I did not take his hand, because I had learned by then that kindness in the wrong form can be mistaken for possession. We followed the riverbank, where the reeds made a soft applause as we moved. Twice we dropped flat as trucks passed on the road. Once we listened while a dog barked at nothing, and I whispered to the dark, the way one whispers to a baby, to hush. At the farm, the woman who owned the house answered my knock with a cooking spoon raised like a weapon. She had taken eggs from me before for a note that said I had inspected her barn, and she must have understood then that the law could be traded like any other produce. When she saw the boy, she did not scream. She looked at me with a hatred so pure it nearly warmed us both. "In the cellar," she said finally, moving aside. "Only for a night." "Only for a night," I repeated, because none of us could bear to plan a future under a roof that did not belong to us. I left her a ration card I had been saving, and she took it as if she were receiving a disease. In the cellar, the air was damp and the potatoes sat in rows like stones in a cemetery. The boy shivered under an old coat. "You must sleep," I said. He did not. Neither did I. The next days braided themselves into a rope I cannot untie. I returned to the village each morning and practiced the profession of not seeing. I signed papers, arranged lists, warmed my hands over the stove in the schoolhouse, and answered questions in a voice that did not tremble. I visited the farm by night. Each time the woman said, "No more," and each time she found a way to say, "One more night." The boy hardly spoke. When he did, the words were knives he was trying to hand to me hilt first. On the 3rd night, he asked if I had children. The question struck with the precision of a sniper. "No," I said. "Once," I added, because truth kept pressing its forehead against the door of my mouth, asking to be let in. "Once I believed I might." He nodded, as if this were complex but not interesting. On the 5th night, he whispered a name in his sleep, Mendel, and then again in a tone so small it could have been a kitchen sound. I wondered if Mendel was a friend, a father, a brother, or a ghost. I did not ask. I had discovered that questions were a luxury like carpets. The inevitable arrived like winter, often predicted, never prepared for. Black car on the road, a knock at the farm gate, 2 men from the city with questions shaped like traps. They were not from my unit, and their shoes were too clean for fields. The woman's face closed like a fist as they spoke. I stood at the gate because an officer at a gate is a kind of document. "We are investigating rumors of partisan activity," the tall one said. And he said rumors as if it were a word that could be sterilized. "We have heard there may be a child." I laughed very mildly, the way I had practiced in mirrors back when my reflection still resembled a person. "A child?" I said. "Here? The only child I have seen on this road is the woman's goat. It bleats like a human when hungry." This earned the slightest curve of the mouth from the driver. The tall one did not smile. "We will look," he said. "I will look," I answered. You will file your request with Captain Weiss, who will tell you to come back tomorrow, by which time this woman will have set aside eggs for your breakfast, and you will have convinced yourselves you are necessary." I took out a paper and made a show of writing a notice for them to present. The driver glanced at his partner. "Authority is performance." I performed. At last they simmered away into the next field, leaving the smell of their anger behind like a perfume that could not afford itself. I walked into the kitchen. The woman set down her spoon with a click. "You will get us killed," she said quietly. "Yes," I answered. "But not tonight." Her mouth twitched as if the ghost of a smile had hardened into scar tissue. "Not tonight," she echoed. I told myself each hour that I was buying an hour, and that hours, if stacked carefully enough, could make a bridge. But night by night the math grew worse, the movements riskier, the river of authority rising. The boy's silence became an accusation I carried like a flask. One evening, a group of my men, bored and drunk on sugar-beet alcohol, decided to hold a shooting contest. Bottles lined on a fence, wagers made with cigarettes, laughter that grew sharper with every miss. The boy, hiding 100 meters away in the ditch where I had told him to wait, would have heard each shot like a drumbeat announcing the end of something unnamed. And I realized then that fear is not the sound itself, but the counting between the sounds. I sent the men on an errand so petty and urgent that they forgot to argue. When I went back to the ditch, the boy had scrawled with a stick in the mud, "E." He had added 3 lines like rays around it, as if trying to bring it light. "Your initial?" I asked. He shrugged. "It can be mine," he said. "Or yours." The generosity struck me in the throat. News came of an inspection tour by an Obersturmbannführer, whose name carried weight like a hammer. He would see our ledgers, walk our lines, ask the kind of questions for which there were only 2 answers, both of them fatal if given with the wrong cadence. I considered fleeing with the boy, north to the forest, west to the river where, a farmer whispered once, a man with a boat waited on moonless nights, but I knew the map of our world better than the men who had drawn it. Lines on paper are the last refuge of cowards. Instead, I chose a smaller escape, the kind that requires a tyrant's attention to detail. I took a requisition form for laborers needed at a road camp near Bochnia, and I added one name in the space between 2 others, squeezed so tight that the letters nearly lay on top of each other. Eli. I attached the captain's stamp I had borrowed and returned so often it had become a small ritual of theft. Then I waited for the day the transport would leave for repair work under a different command, a place where, perhaps, the boy could dissolve into a crowd of men moving stones from one useless place to another. The day arrived with rain that tasted of iron. The Obersturmbannführer walked our yard with a look of polite disgust, as if our brutality were not aesthetically pleasing enough for him. He asked me where I came from. "Bonn," I said. He nodded. "A musical city?" he observed with a smile that did not move past his teeth. "Beethoven," I said. And he brightened briefly because tyrants love to believe they are patrons of something other than fear. "We will make Germany beautiful again," he added, and for a brief insanity I imagined him hearing the creak of our bridge of hours and mistaking it for applause. I kept my eyes the correct distance from his face. He examined our papers and found nothing, because I had learned to arrange nothing like a bouquet. At the platform, the line of laborers shuffled under rain. I stood with my baton and repeated the count in a voice large enough to be safe and small enough to be human. 41, 42, 43. Eli was 44. He kept his chin down, his hat low, his mouth fixed in the kind of hunger that looks like obedience from a distance. He stepped onto the wagon. The chain clinked. The world tilted toward a future so delicate that I did not dare breathe. "Stop," said the voice behind me, a voice trained to slice. The inspector's aide, a man with narrow hands, pointed at the boy's boots. "Those are army boots." I said they were not. He said they were. The conversation was ridiculous and therefore dangerous. "Where did you get them?" he asked the boy, switching to Polish with the smugness of a man showing off a watch. The boy stared at his feet, my mouth filled with the taste of coins. "Answer," the aide said. "He is deaf," I said, before the boy could ruin us both with the truth. "It is why he is good for road work. He does not get distracted by noise." The aide chuckled. "The deaf make terrible workers," he said. They cannot hear orders. Then he is not deaf, I said. And the absurdity, the shameless contradiction somehow satisfied him. Tyranny, like comedy, requires timing. He waved the wagon forward with a flick that told me he had never learned to wave at anything else. The wheels began to move. The boy looked at me for a fraction of a second, and I nodded. And in that nod I poured the strange vocabulary of everything I had not learned to say. 2 days later, a courier brought a note from the Bosnia camp. A laborer, a boy, had been transferred again to a drainage project supervised by a foreman known to take small bribes for large mercies. It was not a guarantee. It was a rumor dressed in the polite clothes of a report. Still, I put the paper in my boot and walked differently because of it. The same afternoon, the Gestapo returned with a list and a warrant to search the farm. The woman looked at me the way a cat looks at a hawk. We played the scene again. My papers, their impatience, the performance of protocol. I could not stop them. In the cellar, they found nothing but the memory of potatoes and the smell of a child who had spent too long learning how to be smaller. On the way out, the short one turned to me and said, "You're sentimental." It was not a compliment. "No," I said, "because there is a way to make the word sound like a verdict." "I am busy," he smiled a little. "The busy ones live," he said. He was wrong, but not that day. The war churned on. Cities fell like rotten teeth. Maps were redrawn by hands that shook, and men who had believed themselves immortal discovered the fragility of bones. I did not become a hero. I did not even become a traitor worthy of song. I carried on the daily craft of making small spaces inside a machine designed to crush everything into one size. Sometimes I succeeded. Often I failed. In spring of the following year, I was reassigned to a depot further west, and then to a front that was not a front so much as a retreat. I learned what a man's face looks like when he realizes there is no center to the chaos. I learned the sound artillery makes when it finds edges of your name. Once moving through a field where the grass had decided stubbornly to be green despite everything, I thought I saw a boy watching from a hedgerow, a boy with a hat too large for his head. I turned and there was no one. Memory is a country without borders or maps. You expect me, I think, to tell you precisely what became of Eli, and I have rehearsed 100 versions to satisfy you. He reached the drainage project and slid sideways into a smuggled train that took him toward a forest where men with eyes like wolves taught him to shoot. Or he found in a ruined church a priest who wrapped him in a burlap robe and called him nephew, until the war forgot him long enough to let him grow old. Or he died the next week of fever in a ditch, and everything I risked was a candle in a wind that did not notice. Or he became a man who, years later, walked into a bakery with a little boy of his own and bought bread with the clumsy generosity of someone who knows exactly how much bread means. I do not know which of these is true. I know only that in the spring of 45, after surrender and shame, and a camp with a fence and a trial with a judge who had been a boy at a piano once, someone to this day, I cannot tell you who, sent me a letter without signature, in a hand that looked like a careful child's. It had no greeting and only one sentence. Spring came to the river this year. I read it and felt something inside me loosen, like a knot deciding it had held long enough. I keep the paper in the bend of an old book that survived more than I did. When people ask, on those rare occasions when anyone still asks men like me anything at all, why I did what I did, I tell them the truth baked down to its simplest crust. Because I could. Because the arithmetic of that hour left a remainder that was a boy. And my ledger for one day, for one name, refused to balance. Do not make me a saint. Saints burn too bright to be useful in the dark. Do not excuse me. Excuses are a second crime that repeats the first in softer clothes. If you must call me anything, call me a witness who finally learned that witnessing is not the same as looking. Nereden izlediğinizi yoruma yazın. Now, when I close my eyes, I do not see the men I delivered, though I carry them like stones. I see instead a pair of boots too large for a boy, feet sloshing inside them, moving along a river that smelled of spring rain and old blood. And I tell myself, because a man must tell himself something or else he dissolves, that he kept walking until the river forgot what had been poured into it, until the mills turned for wheat and not for rumors, until the roads led to houses where doors could be shut with ordinary care. I know there are men who will never forgive me for the uniform I wore, and men who will never forgive me for taking it off too late. I do not ask forgiveness. I ask only that if somewhere, in some unremarkable town, a middle-aged man once laughed unexpectedly at the sound of a dog barking at dusk and felt, in that laugh, a riverbank and a mill and a night when the world tilted in his favor, that he will for a moment forgive himself. If you are listening to this as a voice and not as words, if the cadence of it finds you on a tram or in a small kitchen with the window open to a street that has never known soldiers, remember that history is not an ocean you cross only once. It is a delta of choices, and each small channel leads somewhere no mapmaker bothered to finish. I tell you this not to absolve myself, but to make a petition on behalf of boys who learned too early the grammar of hiding. If there is a set of boots in your life that does not fit, if there is a paper you can stamp that removes precisely one name from a list, do it, and do not wait for the fog to give you permission.